How's it going, everybody? Hope everybody is having a wonderful day. Well, news that came out a couple of days ago, and there's another article about it in the Herald Sun today, is that the AFL are thinking about reviving State of Origin football.
Really?
You heard that right. They're thinking about reviving State of Origin football. It seems that Andrew Dillon is a bit of a fan of it. What do we think of this?
And I know you're skeptical.
Let's just have a bit of a look at the article. State of Origin football could return as soon as next year. Andrew Dillon says the AFL boss is keen to kickstart talks with the players and clubs on reviving the representative fixture. Dillon said that the success of last weekend's Indigenous All-Stars game against Fremantle in Perth had whet the appetite for representative games. There'll certainly be a conversation that I'd like to have with the players, he says, and the clubs. I think there seems to be a bit of a groundswell of support for it. So, what do we think of this? I am still very sceptical as to whether this can work. For starters, the AFL have added another round 2 years ago with Gather Round, another match to the season, a 23rd match to the season. So that makes it even more difficult to fit this into the schedule. There's been some talk that they would play it around this time of the year, around the pre-season. The problem I guess I have with the State of Origin concept is that we're sort of stuck in no man's land. If you look at the representative game in the NRL, the State of Origin, it's played with what you would call 100 out of 100 intensity. Right? They care about it as much as the club games, if not more, or a lot more probably, and it's almost a bit like a grand final for them up there. And if you compare the NBA All-Star game, it's really the opposite. They don't play defense, the team score 200 points each, and no one cares at all about it, and the players don't care about it. Well, the AFL State of Origin is sort of stuck somewhere between those two extremes. It's not played with or cared about any near to the extent of the NRL State of Origin. Most of us would not want to see Zach Merritt get injured, presuming most of you are Essendon supporters watching this, given that I have an Essendon channel. But if you're not an Essendon supporter, insert the champion for your club in there. Most people would not want to see that player get injured representing their state when it could affect the performance of the club side. But at the same time, we do care about it a little bit more than, say, the All-Star game is cared about in the NBA, to use a comparison. So we're stuck in this sort of no man's land where we care about it a bit, but not quite as much as we should.
That is a really good point.
And that's really the problem with it. We're not quite sure where it fits and how to fit it in. I'm not sold as to whether it should be in. However, if it is going to be brought in, there are a few different options. Now, I don't think any of these options are perfect. I think they all have faults. It's a bit like the old saying about democracy. Democracy is the worst system, but except for all the other ones.
Well, that's not really a fair comparison.
So how would it work if they bring it in? Well, they were talking about playing it during the pre-season around this time now. Well, I don't think that's ideal personally, because the players are probably not going to be fit, or at least as match fit. They'll be physically fit, of course, but I don't think they'll be as match fit, and at least they will not be, perhaps it wouldn't be played to the same standard as it would be if it was played in the middle of the year when the players have got a full 8 or 9, 10 games under their belt. So I don't think that's ideal. But what are the options? What are the options as to how it would work? Well, the first option is a tournament, which would go for, say, 3 weeks. You would have Victoria, South Australia and Western Australia playing 2 matches, 1 match against each other, e.g. Victoria plays South Australia and Western Australia, South Australia plays Western Australia and Victoria, etc., etc. And so each team plays 2 matches, and then the top 2 teams play a grand final. So it's essentially a 3-match tournament, and you could do the same for a Division B group of New South Wales / ACT, Queensland and Tasmania as 3 teams, also doing the same thing, playing against each other. This is reasonably fair. You have the best 3 states playing, and then the lesser 3 states playing in a sort of B grade competition, playing against each other, and you're having a grand final. But once again, it's probably too problematic because you've got to fit 3 extra weeks into the schedule. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that's desirable. It makes the season start too early, and it's just not workable. The second option is 1 single match. Victoria versus South Australia, for example, next year, and nothing else. And then the following season, you would have Victoria versus Western Australia. And then the following season, you have Victoria versus South Australia. This fits into the schedule much better, but once again, it is not ideal. As I said, none of these things are ideal. None of them are perfect. The problem with this one, of course, is that Victoria get to play every year, and South Australia and Western Australia and every other state doesn't get to play at all, or in the case of South Australia and Western Australia, only get to play every second year. So it's much easier to fit into the schedule, but it's not as fair on the states because one state gets to play every year, some states don't. The third option is a generic all-star type game where you essentially have all the best players playing in one match. Now, I think if there is to be a representative game somehow in the AFL next year and beyond, this is probably the way they should do it. Not necessarily in this particular way that I'm about to say.
Nobody would care.
But we're getting towards the method that I think is probably most suitable if it is to be brought in at all. Now, a representative game would be something like East versus West, North versus South. I don't like this idea because no one cares about who the teams are. No one cares about the result. It turns into essentially like an all-star game in the NBA where nobody cares about it.
That would be terrible.
But one thing you do have is all the players represented. That's a good thing. And you have one single match, which is a good thing. So it's easy to fit into the schedule and all the players are represented. Unfortunately, what you don't have is any meaningful outcome based on the result. Nobody would care about a generic North versus South, East versus West team. Which leads me to the fourth option, which I think is the best of a bad lot. Like I said, I personally would not bring back State of Origin. I don't think it would fit in the schedule, but I think this fourth option, if there is anything, is probably the way to go. And this fourth option really rubs up a lot of people in South Australia and Western Australia the wrong way, and I'm not doing that deliberately. I'm trying to be as objective as I can with this, but I think the best option, if there is to be representative football, because it ticks as many boxes as possible, is to have a Victoria versus everybody else match. Now, the AFL did this in 2008 when it was the 150th anniversary of the sport, and they had a Victoria versus All-Stars game played at the MCG. There were 70,000 people there, and it was the second highest TV ratings match for the year behind the grand final. So there was some success behind it. Now, why would I do this? Like I said, I probably wouldn't have representative football at all. I think it's too problematic to fit into the schedule. If someone twisted my arm and said, how would you do it? I think this would be the way to go. Why do I think this is the way to go? Well, let me try to sell this particular method to those of you who perhaps don't agree with it or don't think it would be the way to go. So, number one, all the best players in the AFL would be playing in the one game. Now, up until 2008, when the Victoria versus All-Stars match happened, that had never happened before in the history of the game. Never before had the best 44 players, it would be 46 now, but never before had the best 44 players ever played in one game of football all at the same time. That always been split up into states, and because there's more than two states, it means you can't always have the best players, all the best players, in the one game. So this idea means that all the best players can play in the one game. Number two, it has the advantage of being a single game and easy to fit into the schedule. It is much easier to fit one game into the schedule than it is to fit a tournament into the schedule. The third reason why I think this is probably the best of a bad bunch is that Victoria supply 48% of the players in the AFL. This means that if you have a Victoria versus everybody else match, you have two relatively even teams, at least in terms of where you are picking the players from and how they get represented and distributed amongst the teams. The teams, at least in theory, should be of relatively equal standard. The last reason, and probably the most important reason, is that everybody hates Victoria and wants to play against and beat Victoria. That is just the reality. We can dance around that all we want, but that is just simply the reality. You can call a spade, so let's do it. Everybody wants to play and beat Victoria. And a good example of this is back in the 1990s. South Australia would play Western Australia at Football Park, at the old Football Park. And the crowd was, I think, about 17,000. You can look that up. It was a meagre crowd. The stadium was less than half full. Yet, when South Australia host Victoria, the stadium was full. Well, what's the difference? The home team is still the same. It should be, in theory, the same crowd, right? The home team is there to support, the home fans are there to support the home team. And yet they only came out as a sellout when Victoria was the travelling side. So State of Origin does tend to work when Victoria is involved because everybody hates Victoria. Everybody wants to beat Victoria. Victoria are seen as the villains. So whilst this concept of having Victoria versus everybody else, it does tend to rub up the wrong way some of the South Australian and Western Australian punters. And I understand that. I am sort of sympathetic to them in some respects. But the reality is that if you're going to have one match, and you want that one match to work, you really have to have Victoria be one of the teams. Because Victoria really is what makes State of Origin work, because everybody wants to play against them and beat them. That's just the reality, right? Everybody wants to play against and beat Victoria. And this particular match, the one that took place in 2008, and if it was to be done again, you'd have A, all the best players involved in the one game. You would have B, one single match, so it's easy to fit into the schedule. You would have two reasonably fair teams, 48% of the players coming from Victoria, 52% coming from elsewhere. And you would also be playing to the traditional idea of everybody wanting to play against and beat Victoria.
It's growing on me.
Which is what has made State of Origin work. It's actually what made State of Origin work in rugby league. New South Wales being the dominant state and the traditional state, if you like, of rugby league, State of Origin really started to take off when Queensland would take it up to New South Wales and beat them. That was really what made it work. If Queensland was playing against someone else, not that they could because there's only two states, but in theory, if they were playing against someone else, it just wouldn't work. Everybody wants to play against New South Wales and beat them because they're seen as the villains. And everybody wanted Queensland to sort of take it up to them and beat them. That's really what made it work. And really, whilst it hasn't worked as well in the AFL because there are more states and it's harder to fit into the schedule and that sort of thing, the reality is that everybody hates Victoria and wants to play against them and beat them. So I think if the concept was revived, the only way it can really work that ticks as many boxes as possible, and I've listed 4 boxes that it ticks, is to have Victoria versus everybody else. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Do you think reviving State of Origin is a good idea? I would hesitate before doing it. I don't think it can fit into the schedule at the moment. I liked it back in the day. I don't really think it's suitable to use now. But what do you guys think? And if it is to be brought back, how would you do it? Would you use any of the suggestions I've brought forward, or would you try something else? I'd like to hear. So anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe if you like this content. And as always, have a great day.